on a Tuesday, 4 p.m. BST. I am rejoined by Paul Rafelson. Most of you guys will know him in the industry. A lot of activity in and around Mr. Bezos last week. Paul's going to sit down and decipher the message that came out of it. A lot of you guys have obviously watched it as well, but it'd be good to get some of the mechanics behind it all. So, Paul, do you want to give yourself a quick introduction, please?
Sure. My name is Paul Rafelson. I'm an attorney from Ecom Attorneys, sellerbasics.com. I also run the nonprofit application in progress, pending IRS approval, organization called the Online Merchants Guild, which is basically an association that I volunteer to basically try and create sort of an advocacy voice for sellers and take on legal issues that are, for the broader benefit of the community of Amazon sellers, as opposed to, any particular one client. And it's with that we're here today to sort of talk about what's going on in the advocacy space and, what we're advocating for and about, and the relevance of this testimony to that.
Okay, sounds good. Tiff's here, so good morning to Tiff. There's a few people arriving here in the feed.
Good morning.
Let's just start with what happened last week. So you obviously sat down and watched it. It was 5.5 hours long with the testimonies from Apple, Facebook and stuff like that. Give people a top line picture and then we can break down some of the analysis you see.
Yeah, so there's this overlying investigation that's been going on for a while now into the sort of the top tech companies. You've got Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple, and basically sort of just examining, their dominant power, to the extent that, see if, how dominant are they, put it in a word. And what sort of stirred from last year's testimony of Amazon's general counsel, there were some questions that were raised about whether they could basically use sellers' data against them to compete against them. And it was a few months ago, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal basically uncovered the fact that, yeah, you can basically go and, look at individual seller data and use it. The employees have that ability. They regularly exercise that. And in doing so, sorry, I'm just making sure I'm plugged in because I'm not getting power. There you go. In doing so, sort of raised the question of, well, that was inconsistent testimony because, you said one thing last year and now here's this other thing that we found out from the Wall Street Journal. So this time they asked the CEO, Jeff Bezos, back and testify, and sort of along with the CEOs of the other companies, from Apple and Google, and so you had Tim Cook. I can't remember Google CEO.
I know you mean. I know the guy that you're talking about. I forgot what his name is as well, because obviously at one point it was Eric Schmidt, and then obviously it was the two founders, Sergey and
Larry and Sergey.
Larry. Yeah, Sergey.
Yeah, Eric Schmidt's an interesting character. I remember, I worked for Microsoft during the Steve Ballmer years, and those two didn't like each other. It was.
That's mild. And but yeah, I'm not very aware of the new CEO. Obviously he's been around for a bit. He's in a very powerful position. But I don't know much about his background. So on the whole, what did you make of it? Was it a shit show? Was it sensible? Were the right questions asked? Because the last Congress thing with the one with Mark Zuckerberg, some of the questions he was being asked, they didn't even realize that Facebook, proponently is based on advertising. Like, it's how do you make your money? It was like asking questions like that. So what do you think of the questions? Do you feel that they were boxed in meaning they'd ask the questions and then shut them down and then pass over them to box off the question so they don't get a chance to articulate their full explanation?
No, I didn't get the sense. I mean, I thought the questioning for Amazon on the most part was actually pretty good. Yeah. What I saw was a progression, everything's a process, Congress is starting to get it, that they're starting to, it's a slow process, but they're starting to understand the nature of the issues that, we're seeing as sellers, and obviously we're seeing through Online Merchants Guild as seller advocacy, is things Amazon does that, practices that aren't, really appropriate, that may be, a violation of the law. I thought that their insight into just how the seller community works, and that comes from, over the last year or two. I mean, they've been under investigation. I mean, you've got certain parties investigating. You've got, the committee itself conducting investigations. I've spoken to the committee. I've submitted testimony to the committee. A number of sellers have. So now they're getting the real information. They're getting sort of the reality and not hearing, so it's kind of what we want, which is, legislative or some action being taken under the understanding of what really happens. And whereas, like I would say, years ago, it seemed to be more, just a reliance, and we certainly see that at the state level, of what Amazon says they do, and sort of, okay. And here we're seeing, them bringing out contradictory information. It was a little distracting, though, to be honest with you. I didn't like having the other tech CEOs there. I thought there was multiple things. It's sort of, you had, certain parties. One minute they'll be questioning YouTube or Facebook about their censoring of, political information and people making statements about, First Amendment. And then the next minute you're switching into, like, predatory tactics in retail. So it was sort of a really it was like not really the right mix. Like it seemed like there were two different things going on, or more than two.
It didn't flow. It was all over the place, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Ideally, you want to build to a crescendo. It starts somewhere and ends somewhere in a natural where they should land. But it was just a bit bitty.
Yeah, and it was extended into the questioning. So it went on for it was 5 or 6 hours. It was a long
5.5 hours, I think it was.
Yeah. It was a long session. And so obviously I was, cutting through, just focusing mainly on the Amazon part, and kind of just getting annoyed that, you get some momentum. I think you're absolutely right about that crescendo effect, that, it would just totally change the tone, because one minute they're making headway, and like you're hearing the questions, you're like, wait, that's what you need to be asking. That's where you should go. Keep asking about that. Their time's up. And then the next question is directed towards, Mark Zuckerberg about, censorship of extremist groups and what they define as an extremist group. And it was just sort of like, that just the buzz.
So just to back up a little bit, can you disclose what you submitted so it gives the background of the story? Because obviously their questions is based on what's been fed by the community and others.
So
ask those questions.
I will be disclosing. I haven't actually sent it. It's due 5 legislative days after the hearing. So I wanted this time not to submit, because I knew they weren't going to read it in time. And I wanted to really take into account what was said and incorporate that into what we will submit. And if it's not too late, if you have something you want to submit, I do have a template that we can share if people want to reach out and say something. Certainly Congress wants to hear. But I mean, the overall message is just kind of, it's consistent with what we've been saying in the past, just sort of the ways that Amazon sellers are reliant on Amazon as the primary source of revenue. So the sort of the tying of FBA to Amazon's practices, some of the dirtier practices that they've done. Box is obviously buy box manipulation has been one of interest to the committee. I don't remember what else we addressed, but I'm actually going to submit it today. I'm just putting the finishing touches on it and just talking about just the general mistreatment of sellers.
Yeah.
One of the themes one of my theories about Amazon, and this is maybe unpopular, but I actually do think that there is a need to break them up a little bit here. And the way I see it is, I kind of look at FBA, the Prime delivery network and the Prime customer base is sort of their secret weapon. Like that, they have that captive audience of, loyal Prime users who, have become reliant on 2-day shipping. And, here's Amazon having built this sort of what I sort of call the railroad of e-commerce. And I was happy to hear other Congress people using that term as well, that Amazon has sort of become the railroad of e-commerce. And, so the question is, as a participant in the market who uses the railroad, should they also be an owner of the railroad and a user? So the analogy that I often use is, I say, it's like if you could imagine back in the day, Henry Ford, having the Model T and experiencing all that success, going around to different states and saying, we're going to build these super roads in your state called highways. We want you to fund it. We want you to help pay for it. But at the end of it all, these highways are going to be ours. You're not going to own it, but we're going to create all these jobs. So you'll want to subsidize it. And at the end of the day, only Ford drivers will get to use it. So, unfortunately, if you have a Chevrolet, you've got to take the back roads. You've got to take the side roads. You can't use our highway. So obviously, this pushes people into buying Ford versus Chevy because you get that highway access. And Amazon, in a way, has kind of done that with the fulfillment network and developing sort of inorganically 70% of U.S. households as Prime members in a very short window of time, in light of a lot of the benefits that they receive from the government. And so the question is, one idea is, one way to sort of take away Amazon's market power is to sort of separate their place in the world as a retail store from their ability to control the railroad that that other retail stores could benefit from, so that you can sort of undo some of the monopolistic damage. If Prime members have the ability to single sign on into Shopify or even to Bloomingdale's, you sort of can take that captive audience and spread their attention out away from Amazon, and that sort of levels the playing field where, you can sort of undo some of that damage. Now, it's a little extreme, but I don't know what else to do. It's hard to see how you fix this. We've just become so reliant on Amazon, and it's a scary proposition that's how our business is. We're so reliant on this one company for our income.
So how do you think, let's get into the key thing, as everyone listening is obviously going to want to know about your thoughts on the questioning around the data, but quickly back up. How do you think he performed under the microscope?
I didn't think he performed any different than I expected. He's a CEO of a large company, so there's a lot of plausible deniability. I don't know what every employee does in my company. It's impossible to know. Yeah. I found, other sellers picked up on this. I noticed in certain comments that they kind of found it just to be, a lot of dodging the question. A lot of, if that's happening, we're gonna, allow me to come back to you.
Do you think it was disingenuous, or do you reckon he was serious?
I unfortunately did. I think he just, it just didn't come off like the sincerity that was there. I've sort of said it was sort of fake sincerity that you would expect. These people go through a ton of training. They're simulating this experience multiple times. Lots of lawyers and people in the room. That was what he was trying to go for, like sort of you've rung the alarm bells here. I'm so surprised to see this. This is horrible. This is not the Amazon I wanted to create. We're an amazing company. We do amazing. It's just, it's how can you not be aware of what's been going on? It's been, it's a cutthroat style company. The culture came from somewhere, right? So at the very least, it's hard to imagine that.
Well, normally that's top down, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It is. And I know insiders from Amazon, and my wife used to work for Seller Performance. It was known in 2008, for example, that the seller data thing was like, you're taking your business in your own hand. You sell on Amazon because it was known that they have access to it. So I didn't really find his performance to be much of anything, really. It just didn't. It was just predictable. And it wasn't, unfortunately, and I'm not sure there was much he could have done not to be. I don't know what else, he could say other than just, making some declaration like, from now on, here's how it's going to be. Well, we're so sorry, but that's obviously not going to happen and not realistic. So it was pretty much par for the course, what we expected.
Yeah, I'm just looking up quickly here on the Tinternet. Just trying to find that quote. Here's what I can tell you Bezos offered instead. We do have certain safeguards in place. We do train people, and we expect people to follow that policy as they would any other. But Bezos also concluded that he can't guarantee that the policy is never been violated. So he's got to cover his backside, of course, but then what do you do? It's a big company, and if it's a competitive culture and they've got access, what you're doing is you're just relying on the credibility of the individual, aren't you? Whether they access that data are not. Tiff says, what does he think about Bezos stating he does not know about third parties being suspended with no reinstatement and for no good reason, such as the bookseller that they covered?
I mean, doesn't he read his email? He must get like 1,000 emails a day about being suspended and no recovery, right? That's where you go when you don't. I'm being facetious, obviously. No, I mean, of course he knows. I mean, I think obviously from his perspective, this is our policy. This is what we do to protect, ourselves, and obviously they're going to do that. Does he fully understand, how awful it is to be on Amazon? I mean, is there probably levels of improvement we could see there, maybe coming out of this, perhaps, but I think, I think that change, personally, I think that change needs to come from Congress. I think, like what we did with California when we were lobbying, we had the AB 1790 bill, and that sort of is what, led to the 72-hour suspension process in America. Like, and that warning notice was the, came out of that bill and lobbying for that bill. And, it's not a great bill, but it's the first of its kind, and it's a starting point. We would like to see that become a federal law, that there needs to be sort of some protection for these small participants, who use these massive marketplaces, that there needs to be a certain level, base level of treatment and expectation there. So, yeah.
So with that in mind, obviously he's dodged a few questions. What do you think is the outcome now? How do you think, if you had a crystal ball, there obviously the data question's been asked. He can't clarify whether or not they've used it with intent from what he is saying. Like, you don't know what goes on behind closed doors. But do you think that's a shoring up of the ship now? Do you think that now that that's been exposed and spoke about publicly and it's become a public thing, do you think we're going to see less of that activity moving forward?
So it's an interesting defense. It's sort of the defense of, we didn't do, so basically the way I hear it is, to the extent that may have happened, we didn't do what it takes to safeguard the information. It's sort of like Facebook back in the day. There used to be a thing where like any Facebook employee could go through the profile of any Facebook user. It was just that open, right? And it was kind of like, people were abusing it. And so obviously they recognized at some point they need to lock that down and not just say, because you work for Facebook, you can go and peek into anybody's life, recognizing that people can do that. So, and that's foreseeable. So, I mean, it was foreseeable. I have a bigger theory about this whole competing against sellers thing, that I'm not so sure it's as important as they make it out to be. I think it makes for great news bites, but in terms of like things Amazon does that I don't really think are appropriate in their treatment of sellers, I'd say this one's pretty low. And here's why. It happens. We've seen it happen. That's undeniable. And I'll get into a little bit more how it happens and sort of how they claim it happens the right way versus, what actually happened. But, in reality, Amazon's private label business predominantly is batteries. They're not a huge, a lot of these brands they're creating, it's awful to have that experience, but statistically, it's not their path towards dominance. And I think the story sounds worse. It's a sad story, and it's an unfortunate story. But in terms of like, what are the things that Amazon does? I don't actually find that to be the worst of it, right? Because it's just not on such a massive scale, and it's just not. But just the soundbite of that, you use somebody's data to, you said you were this marketplace, and then you use their data to push them out of business. Sounds awful, but and I think Amazon likes that. That's the dialogue and that's the story, and I think that's one of the things we need to work on, is saying there's worse things going on than this competing against sellers thing. But I think they like it because it's very defensible. It's defensible to them for a number of reasons. One, they are, I've been on many times and we've talked about things like taxes and price gouging and IP, and what's sort of the theme is that, how does Amazon, how are we always in this situation where, sellers are being held accountable for things like price gouging or sales taxes? Because Amazon says, we're not a store, we're a marketplace. But in the context of these antitrust hearings, inconsistency we've noticed over and over again is that under oath, they say it is our store. It's our store. In other contexts, like the tax cases that they file also under oath, they say it's not our store. How dare you call us a store? We're just a mall. So which one is it, right? And to the extent that they are considered a store, which I actually kind of agree that they are, I actually think, what they're saying in the antitrust test is in terms of...
It is called the everything store, right?
Right, it is. It's the everything store, it's the Amazon, right? They say that. I mean, he says it in his opening statement. If you go read it, it's like when we invited sellers into our store, it's like and you go through the testimony, the written responses they submitted last year. It's very clear that they want the antitrust committee to view them as a singular store with selling partners. And the reason that is because the practice of creating a private label product, right? Like if you have Kirkland brand in America, or Tesco brand something, because that's a sanctioned practice. It's deemed good for consumers, right? It's a lower priced competing alternative offered by the store, or white label by the store. That's not antitrust behavior. So the more you can sort of classify Amazon as a store, but it's just very two-faced, because we know that in all other contexts it's the opposite. So how can you be both under oath? That's a rhyme. So that sort of lays the foundation for, I think, where Amazon goes. And I think they like the story. I think it's the story that, okay, well, we messed up. We didn't safeguard the data. But there's other issues. I mean, there's the data that is, and to their point, there's the data that's publicly available. I mean, what you're supposed to do, I think what Amazon's trying to say is the way we do compete with sellers is what we're supposed to do is look at the data in the aggregate, right? Yeah. The same data that could fuel Helium-10 or Jungle Scout, right? And really, at the end of the day, we're not looking at anything different than what any person on the outside can look at using the right tools and connecting to our API and getting a sense of what products are doing well, how many sellers there are on of that type, and that type of data is fair game. So that's their point. And then, there were some bad actors who, unfortunately were able to dig a little deeper and get data that they weren't supposed to. And we're going to remedy that.
That's I'll come on to in a sec. Let me just, in the comments, Alan Gordon here says, "Hey, Danny, Paul, to everyone." Susan says, "This may be why Facebook and Shopify is ramping up ads, knowing that Amazon is being the way they are." Well, she said, being a bitch to sellers. Shareem says, "I agree with Paul. The data thing doesn't affect sellers as much as, for example, hijackers." There's something I want to go on to in a minute. Susan's come back and says, "Does Paul have a blog or website that we can keep up to on e-commerce in news such as this is what's going on? I had no idea Bezos was questioned, or can you suggest a site to be in the know on these kind of matters?"
Yeah.
Not the Washington Post.
Yeah, I'm actually posting. I'm pulling up as we talk the link so you can watch the testimony.
While you're pulling that up, this is the thing I just want to read out to go here. It says, Rep Hank Johnson asked Bezos about the story from PopSockets, which sells mobile phone accessories, that Amazon was selling counterfeit versions of the product. The PopSockets founder told the committee that Amazon only stopped after it promised to purchase $2 million in advertisements. Bezos come back, says, "If these are the facts, that's unacceptable." Bezos said, "I'd look into that and come back to you. Come back to your office." That's interesting as well, isn't it? In terms of leveraging there. What else have we got?
Yeah, the PopSockets thing is interesting. I just posted privately because I don't know how to post publicly. I guess because I'm not in the Facebook.
Okay. Yeah. Let me grab that link.
You can watch the.
Okay. Yeah, I got that. I'll put this in the chat now. And
then, a lot of trolling. Because like I said, it's very interrupted, because one minute they're inquiring from Jeff, and the next minute they switch over to somebody else about Herman Cain, or is whether Herman Cain is a terrorist, and it's or whatever extremist. It's just very odd.
So what do you take from that then? Obviously, that's a bit of leveraging, spend on ads, and the counterfeits will stop. I mean, that to me that sounds a bit of a stretch, but what do I know? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it could have happened. I mean, I think we did in our testimony talk about PPC as sort of a pay-to-play mechanism that's being tied with Amazon. That there's this element of that they're becoming quickly one of the largest advertising companies in the world within their own platform, obviously. But it's whether that's just another form of sort of tacking on fees. It's sort of raising that point. PopSockets is interesting. I mean, I don't know how much. I'm a little skeptical of PopSockets because they're also one of the number one enforcers of unauthorized selling, and I question their definition of counterfeit, if that was really even true. Like I'm sure there have been counterfeit PopSockets, but They sued somebody in Colorado, because they were selling unauthorized, or, they weren't an authorized PopSockets dealers, that whole first sale doctrine versus right to quality control issue. And so I question whether, their lawyers took liberty in the definition of counterfeit so as to make the problem worse, and, whether it was really counterfeit. So, I mean, I'm a little skeptical of PopSockets in general, because of, they're one of these, you don't have the right to sell my product companies, which, is an open question. It's not well settled law, and they've sued somebody about it. And it's to sort of sell product you're not authorized to sell than to actually make counterfeit versions of it. Those are two different things. So, whether that was really, we'll stop the counterfeits if you pay 2 million PPC, or if you want your PopSockets authorized listings to be prominent over other unauthorized listings, but which are not counterfeit, you may have to spend a lot in PPC. I mean, I just don't give them a ton of credit without knowing more. But obviously, if it did happen in that context, if it's truly counterfeit, then yeah, I mean, that's a bad story. But I spend most of my life in big companies. I don't know that. I don't know if I doubt Jeff Bezos had any say in that transaction. I mean, there's truth to that.
I mean, I'll paste this in there. This is from the Observer. I'll drop it into the feed. One kind of interesting, because they're basically what the Observer is saying. I've just posted it in a link. Is that he's not as well versed in the retail business as he once was, effectively. So it makes it difficult to answer some of these questions, or at least had the same level of handle on it with so many other businesses under the Amazon umbrella.
I think that's a good point too, because like Walmart, their CEOs usually are like people who came up through the company and really know retail, whereas they're the largest defense contract, or with cloud company, and they're trying to get CIA contracts and national security. I mean, he's all over the place. I really doubt. I mean, $2 million of PPC spend is not even relevant.
It doesn't touch the sides at Amazon.
He's not getting involved in that. He doesn't care. It doesn't even move the needle in that company. The concept of materiality, just to understand. I mean, a number like that's like that could just be some.
He's earning that a day.
Yeah,
he earns that a day himself, doesn't he? In self-worth. Okay, so in wealth, sorry. Side B, regular of the show. You could probably answer this, Paul, because obviously you worked at a beast of a company, being Microsoft, in a period where that was considered part, a bit of a monopoly, wasn't it? So these tech companies are so huge and driven and driving the technology. So how can they be policed? Should their scale be capped? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Microsoft has an issue with, tying and sort of, had the issue of, including the browsers, for example. That was a big issue of, not having browser choice inside of their Windows operating system. And so people were by default Internet Explorer users. Obviously, things have changed since then. I think the problem with policing these companies is that when the technology is new and you don't understand it, you're always behind the curve. So they sort of become monopolies to the extent that they are demonopolies, because, the government's just so far behind the 8 ball. By the time these things are, by the time they become behemoths, it's hard to say. It's hard to really, take action or to prevent it. So it's always after the fact, and it's hard to police. But I think with Microsoft, there was an organic changeover. Microsoft, when I was there, was very anti-phone. Steve Ballmer famously said, nobody
it's
wants
never going to work. Yeah.
It's never going to work. They'll never sell 1 million units. This was in 2007 when iPhone launched. People want a physical keyboard. They don't want to touch type. And people may not remember, in 2007, Windows was the #1 phone software. Every phone was every smartphone pretty much ran on Windows Mobile. And boy, did that change, and the whole change, right? Sort of Mac and Android and Windows is struggling to maintain significance outside the core business machines and use. But it's people are more reliant on Apple products now to get a lot of stuff done, to get productivity done in a way that there was nothing like. Apple was a nothing when I was at Microsoft. They were nobody had a Mac. Nobody use an iPhone. It's just amazing how that they've changed the landscape. So there's always competition and ways to change. I think with the tech companies like Google, the issue there is, and Facebook does their position of being in a monopolistic position, and then having to censor people. It's always a little scary. I mean, I'm a big constitutional law person. I like the First Amendment. I don't like the idea of government censorship, and I don't like the idea of private companies actively censoring because they're told they have to by the government. I think there's too much subjectivity. When I was younger, if somebody had a terrible message, usually it was just mass. The masses just didn't acknowledge you. When you start censoring people actively in a way that could arguably violate the Constitution, to the extent the message is ridiculous, I feel like we start to give more significance to those messages when we censor, because it's the act of censoring them that draws attention to the message. I hope I'm saying this right. So I worry about the future of this kind of, tech companies being responsible. And I think it is the government's responsibility to censor, but obviously the First Amendment, how they can do that. And it's an interesting one. But with Amazon, it's kind of easy. I mean, I think Amazon really engaged in some cutthroat tactics. Not that Microsoft didn't in its day, but some really cutthroat tactics at sort of, how they got to be where they are. They've engaged in sort of a practice of what I call basically not playing by the same rules. And so they've always had an unfair advantage, right? There's a reason you won't find as easily in the Walmart store, the Target store, products that contain high quantities of lead or other toxic materials, because as having worked for Walmart too, and their corporate offices in Arkansas, and having worked for GE and other big companies, like, you have internal audit programs that are going to go down to the manufacturing level overseas, and they're going to audit their vendors, right? I mean, Microsoft is going to audit Flextronics or whomever's making Xbox. I don't remember which one of those companies it was, and they're going to make sure that they're not, using, illegal labor. They're not using, Nike does the same thing. Right. So they have to take accountability for the products that come into their stores, and Walmart, same thing, and Target, same thing. They have to make sure that their suppliers are following those rules and have those programs. So there's a sort of constant system of checking that goes on through the supply chain that's designed to minimize the probability that, goods made, in a way that violates certain laws about, say, like child labor, don't end up in their stores. Amazon's approach has always been different. It's always been, let's just not call ourselves a store and then flood the market with whatever, and then we don't have to take responsibility for what happens. So why is there, 1 million plus sellers in the country of China who sell on Amazon and they don't have to play by the rules, because Amazon basically dismisses their role and responsibility that a typical retailer would never do, to ensure that the products that come in are safe. Now, US-based sellers, UK-based sellers, European sellers have more of an incentive, especially US-based sellers, because we live in a litigious country, right? So we're more inclined to take the steps to make sure our products are safe, and to have them insured in the event that something does happen. There's a way to recover, right? A seller in China has no incentive to necessarily do those things, and then yet those dangerous products flood the market, and they're good for prices because it makes things cheaper. So customers, Prime members, there's always a cheaper version of the thing made from China, despite that it might violate, may not be compliant with, the electronics rules. Was it CE? What's the UL? It may not be UL compliant. Maybe it's violating somebody's patent, but you know what? It gets through it. And from my perspective, Amazon's goal is, I kind of look at Amazon as being like Costco internet. Like their value, their goal isn't to dominate by taking over its sellers. Like, I think that's the misconception. This is why the competing against sellers thing, I don't think is a strong thing, is because I think when we look at antitrust, we think antitrust is in right now is really about a theory of protecting consumers, right? Protecting consumers from high prices, making sure that there's competition, that there's no dominance. And Amazon does that really well inside the marketplace. That's why they make your data publicly available through the API, so that people can go on Helium and learn about what you're doing, because they want to encourage that pile on of competition, because that drives prices down. And Prime members happy because they have competition. So in a way, Amazon is serving the consumer through how it operates the Amazon marketplace and ensuring competition and low prices. But low prices is what drives people to stay Prime members. That's why Amazon is so vigilant about punishing sellers who, for example, if a price of your product on Amazon is lower on eBay, we know this, right? Originally, you would get a pricing error. Now you find that your listing is suppressed, right? Yeah. That's the latest of that. So Amazon's goal is to make sure that a Prime member never has the perception that there's a better value outside of Prime, and that's what their goal is. So their dominance isn't necessarily through being, through the products that are sold inside, but to make sure they can maintain 70% of all households and continue to increase that and raise the price of that. And that's where I think Congress needs to be looking, is just how Amazon is sort of using their model to basically make Prime the dominant part of the equation. So it
makes sense. Right. So if we wrap here, just quick final thoughts on post-Congress of last week. Give me a roadmap for the last 18 months.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's...
not the upcoming 18 months, other than COVID.
Yeah. I think it's going to be interesting to see what action, if any, Congress takes. I mean, Amazon is big, so they're going to fight if it's too dramatic. But I think Congress really needs to take some action. I'm interested to see what Walmart is doing with Shopify, if there's any way at all. I'm not confident. I mean, Apple did eventually. Nobody thought anyone could dethrone Microsoft. Apple did it. So I'm always interested to see how this, what's the next move, because Amazon's role as a dominant player and sort of almost as a monopoly is going to, it will change. There will be something it always does. It's always just the way of technology in the world. So I'm not sure we'll see what that is in the next 18 months, but I want to see Congress, take meaningful action to bring fairness to the Amazon marketplace, bring fairness to the sellers. And I think it's important that if you have stories or if you have perspective you want to share, that you tell Congress. And so if you're interested in submitting testimony, email me, paul@onlinemerchantsguild.org or paul@ecomattorneys.com. Don't have a lot of time, but there are plenty of opportunities if you want to, there's investigators who want to talk to people. So if you have a story to tell, let us know, and just keep watching and support the Online Merchants Guild effort. And let's keep advocating. Ideally, one day I would like to be able to raise about 20 to 25 grand a month to actually install a lobbying effort in the federal government to push back on Amazon's spending. I mean, $20,000 to $25,000 a month doesn't even pales in comparison to Amazon's millions. But what's cool about our lobbying is that we actually have voters. We have actual people who vote in these districts. Mm-hmm. So in a way, we have an advantage if we can get some lobbying spend. But until then, I expect Amazon to do what it does, spin things the way it spins things. But I expect the government to start to, they're becoming more and more savvy, and they're making it clear that there's certain people in the government clear that they're after Amazon. And I hope to see some meaningful change and further pursuit of this, because we want fairness for sellers in the marketplace. That's all we want: fairness and choice, opportunity. So. And
it's a lovely place to end. So quickly run through email address to reach you again, Paul, for anything.
So for advocacy related stuff, you're just interested in talking to Congress or sharing your story with somebody, or if you have a story you want us to know about and help communicate on your behalf that you think is interesting, paul@onlinemerchantsguild.org. If you have any legal issues or, suspension issues, whatever it is, paul@ecomattorneys, ecomattorneys.com is my law firm email address, and we'd be happy to talk to you. And if you're just interested in our suspension program, sellerbasics.com is really cool. Check it out. And it's designed to make suspension make suspension tolerable, to the extent you can,
Makes sense. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Paul, thanks for joining us. We'll be back here 4 p.m. BST tomorrow. I do believe we're going to be covering sourcing from Vietnam. So I look forward to seeing everyone then. Stay safe, take care of your family, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.